Oh, hello, good afternoon, and welcome everybody. My name is Ana Cortez. I am the Secretary of the Committee for Development Policy, and I would like to welcome you all to this panel discussion by the CDP. As you know, the committee is meeting in plenary session during this week with a very rich and interesting agenda. Which focus in particular on the issue of how to promote productive capacity for achieving the goals of the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda. And we thought it would be interesting to share with you some of the highlights of the CDP discussion and some of the recommendations that they will be making to the Economic and Social Council. As you may know, the committee is a subsidiary body of ECOSOC, and it produces an annual report to the council. And so this is like a peek preview, a sneak preview, if you will, of the CDP report on the topic of productive capacity. So we are very fortunate to have here today with us José Antonio Ocampo. He is the chair of the CDP, and he's also a professor at Columbia University, and he will be our moderator for this panel discussion. At my far right, I have Professor Emeritus Diane Elson from Essex University in England. By her side, I have Professor Stefan Klassen of Gothenburg University in Germany. And here, by my left, I have Professor Keith Nurse of the University of West Indies in Barbados. So I'll pass the floor to Professor Ocampo to continue with our discussions.
Yeah, well, thank you to all of you for coming. This panel is actually on the major issue that we have chosen for this year in our contribution to the discussions on ECOSOC on, let's say, on the implementation of Agenda 2030. Moving to action is, I think, is the topic. From commitments to action. Okay, so we're talking about action, how to. And also, it's of course important to note that this year is also the midterm review of the Istanbul Program of Action on the LDCs, and that review, as well as our own, it does show that there is a significant lag in this issue of productive capacities, or developing productive capacities in least developed countries. That's actually one of the major gaps in the achievement of the Istanbul Program of Action. So I think the choice of topic was I think very good, and we hope we are in the process of reaching our final conclusions that we're going to present to ECOSOC. But let me perhaps, I mean, our three, the members of the committee who are going to speak today will address different dimensions of this issue. Let's say in economic terms, of course, is the issue of diversification of production structure, and this is the accumulation of gradual accumulation of technological capabilities and productive capabilities, which is a challenge, by the way, which is quite diverse, depending on the nature of the LDC. I mean, we discuss the different types of LDCs, let's say, that there are, because it's a very heterogeneous family that includes, from countries with large domestic markets and a few which have, been industrializing to also countries that are basically natural resource dependent, to countries that are small islands in the Pacific, some of them very remote, to some countries that are also still undergoing conflict. So it's a very diverse family, and we don't think there is no one fits all approach to them. But in any case, this issue of productive capacities is a broad issue that will have to be addressed in different ways in different types of countries. The second issue, of course, which is equally important, is the accumulation of human capabilities and the many dimensions that involves, from education, health, social protection, to the equity issues, and of course we have underscored in particular the issue of gender equality as something that has to cut across the whole agenda. And the third is the environmental vulnerabilities and guaranteeing that development does not increase those vulnerabilities, and in some cases these countries are extremely environmentally vulnerable because of the implications of climate change on some of them, notably the Pacific Islands, some of which have not been able, the graduation has been postponed even when they reach other threshold because of this, some environmental catastrophe that they have faced. So this is a third element in the recommendations that we're going to present. And of course, cutting across all of them is the issue of good governance structures that have to be built to be able to guarantee, this, the fulfillment of the three dimensions of sustainable development. With this, very broad introduction, let me give the floor to each of them who is going to focus on, a specific dimension of this challenge. And so I'll give the floor first to Stefan Klassen.
Okay, thanks very much. So what I'm going to talk about in almost 10 minutes is a little bit about the international dimension of support programs for LDCs and to what extent they are helping build up productive capacity. So basically the two main instruments I'm going to talk about are trade preferences as well as aid for trade. And as the two potential areas that could support the build-up of productive capacity. So as you may know, LDCs enjoy trade preferences, and under the generalized system of preferences of virtually all trading partners. So these are kind of WTO conforming preferences given, although each country trading partner decides how much of a trade preference to give under these GSP rules. These trade preferences have gotten a lot wider in recent years, so in a sense they're covering more items, and the goal was they should cover 95% of items. Not all countries have reached that. And it's also gotten wider in terms of coverage of countries, so there are more countries giving trade preferences to LDCs, including also emerging economies and other developing countries which are now giving trade preferences under this GSP rules. And the system will continue. It was recently extended by WTO as an option up until I think 2026. Then of course there's some specific additional deals that LDCs enjoy, like the Everything But Arms initiative in the European Union and others. The sectors that benefit particularly are agriculture, textile, and clothing, because these are areas which otherwise are facing a fair amount of protection, and as a result, of course, having trade preferences there has the largest impact. On the other hand, of course, so in some sort of sense, things have preferences have gotten better for LDCs in many ways. At the same time, of course, we've had global trade liberalization, so there's been a preference erosion in that sense, as trade has generally gotten freer. Therefore, the benefit of getting preferences is getting smaller. So to that extent, it becomes an empirical question then, to what extent these preferences help promote exports of LDCs. And that's what we did. So we did a very extensive new econometric analysis of trying to understand to what extent trade preferences are actually promoting exports. And we find that LDCs are basically able to increase their exports by about 30% as a result, compared to other developing countries, as a result of being a part of these preference schemes. We find that the schemes by Canada, Australia, and the EU are particularly leading to higher exports from LDCs, less so the schemes by the US, Japan, Russia, and a few others. The preferences are actually even larger when we compare LDCs not with the entire group of developing countries, but with a group of countries that are very similar to LDCs. As you know, that we have some sort of complicated rules of inclusion and graduation, and as a result, we actually have quite a few countries out there that are, in terms of all indicators, very similar to LDCs, but happen not to be LDCs for mostly historical reasons, sometimes political reasons. And when we compare those countries with each other, we then find the impact is even larger. So 79% is the cumulative impact on exports for LDCs compared to those countries that are similar to them, but not on that list. The benefits are particularly there for LDCs with a sizable manufacturing base. So countries like Bangladesh, Cambodia, Nepal, Myanmar, those are the ones that are benefiting a lot more, while the other ones, small countries with little manufacturing base, don't benefit so much. Although some are starting, like Lesotho or Ethiopia. So that's on our findings. We also looked a little bit at aid for trade, and we find that there is an increasing share of aid devoted to promote trade for hard and soft infrastructure, building productive capacity, and so on. In general, that's important and welcome because some of the difficulties LDCs face in trading more relates to trade infrastructure, trade costs, and so on. So in that sense, this is very welcome. At the same time, one has to be a bit cautious when looking at these aid for trade figures. Quite a bit seems to be relabeling of existing aid that now is called aid for trade and used to be called infrastructure or something else. It's often not focused enough on lowering trade costs. It's often not focused enough on LDCs. When one looks at impact evaluations, one finds it's generally positive, but particularly on volumes of exports, but not necessarily on diversification. And the benefits could be substantially larger. So that leads me to a number of conclusions on this. The first is the kind of standard international instruments in terms of trade preferences, aid for trade for LDCs, are important tools to promote exports. And so the recent efforts to enhance them are clearly something that should be supported. Second, they only work for a subset of LDCs with a potentially internationally competitive manufacturing sector. And so, of course, they do not solve the productive capacity problem for example, the many very small and remote economies, or those who are relying heavily on natural resource exports for whom development of manufacturing sector is particularly difficult. Third, of course, the success in promoting exports means that graduating from the LDC category of those countries can have serious impacts. So as countries like Nepal, Cambodia, and Bangladesh are getting closer to meeting the criteria for graduation, it will be very important for them as well as the international community to work with them on a long-term smooth transition path so that they will not actually lose benefits upon graduation and are then basically worse off than they were before. And one element of that, and I think Keith is going to say a little bit more about that, will be to move more towards higher value exports that are somewhat less dependent on just the nature of the trade preferences. Fourth point, the impact of aid for trade and trade preferences has mostly on export volumes. It hasn't really solved the diversification dilemma for many LDCs, and that's something that particularly those who are benefiting on volumes need to work on more, and so that's an important issue. Lastly, so basically the way we see it is it provides an opportunity, but it depends to some degree on the country seizing it. First, in terms of developing export sectors that can benefit from these measures, in terms of diversifying and upgrading, that it's not just used as a kind of way to get cheap export goods into world markets, and as a way to increase the trade benefits to the economy at large. So it shouldn't, addressing, for example, potentially negative social and environmental side effects, which, of course, one has to take into account as well. And I guess maybe Diane was going to say more on that score. So thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Stefan. Now, Diane Elson.
So Stefan has outlined how the support of the international community for the least developed countries very much focused on enabling them to export more, and talked about the distribution of the benefits from this, and particularly highlighted the fact that those countries with a manufacturing base are the ones that benefit most. And of course, that's only a small group among the least developed countries. But even when we've got that success in terms of more exports, we still got a problem about how far this is going to address that wider agenda that we're now all focusing on of the Sustainable Development Goals, where we have not only inclusive growth, but also decent work, also reducing inequality, including gender inequality, as well as improving health and education and nutrition. So we've got quite a wide range of goals. And one of the challenges is, can you translate the export success into benefits across this wide range of goals? Can you get a positive synergy between the export success and the improvement on this wider range of goals that we've now as an international community embraced? So I just want to give one example of the challenges there, which is the success in exporting garment manufacturers in a number of LDCs. On the one hand, has created jobs for a group, mainly women, who before didn't have that kind of employment, and maybe it's improved their opportunities compared with what they had before. Better to be a factory worker than to be a maid in many countries, but also challenges, particularly in terms of the safety or otherwise of the working conditions, the very long hours of work with its challenges for health, the high rates of turnover and absenteeism that may go along with long hours of work and unhealthy working conditions. So there's a challenge, if you like, in converting that employment into employment that meets the criteria of decent work and is also enhancing health of those workers. Now, there are some examples. Once this problem is recognized, there are policies that you can introduce to address it. So I just want to highlight one example where the international community is supporting countries, some of the least developed countries, with a garment sector that's doing well in terms of exports, in improving the quality of employment there. There's something called the Better Work Program, developed by the International Labour Organization and the International Finance Corporation to assist small and medium-scale manufacturers of garments in countries in Asia with a substantial garment sector to improve the quality of their work in ways that also enhances the productivity. And preliminary reports do suggest there are quite a lot of successes with this kind of initiative. So I think I wanted to highlight this as an example of how, on the one hand, there can be negative trade-offs between the increase in exports and some of the components of the SDGs, but on the other hand, these can be turned around to become positive relationships if you have appropriate interventions like the Better Work Program. And that's only one of a number of initiatives to try and improve the quality of work in the garment sector. Stefan also mentioned issues of agriculture and natural resources, and countries which have a large agricultural sector have not benefited so much from the trade preferences and aid for trade. And indeed, the background research that's been provided to the Committee for Development Policy showed that in many of the larger LDCs in sub-Saharan Africa, per capita food production is 30% lower now compared with the 1960s. And that, I find, was a truly shocking statistic on the challenge that there is in building the productive capacity in food production in the least developed countries and addressing the problems of food security. However, and this is partly the result of the huge policy neglect of agriculture compared with some other sectors of the economy, but also compounded by gendered constraints in this section. Women, smallholder farmers, are very important in producing food in many of the least developed countries that have a large agricultural sector, but they face gendered constraints in improving their productivity. They have very often little direct or secure access to land, to agricultural inputs, to training, and to the rural institutions that manage and make decisions. And this is a good example of where you can have a positive synergy between addressing one of the Sustainable Development Goals, Goal 5, about promoting gender equality, and the wish to increase productive capacity and promote sustainable growth. Because if you invest in removing these gendered constraints, you can secure increases in productivity in smallholder agriculture in ways that will address some of the issues of food security. So I think that's an example of the positive synergies that there can be between increasing productive capacity and the wider range of the SDGs, but that needs specific policy interventions to address that. Now let me turn to the broader issue of what's very often called the social sector. And I think very often we tend to set up perhaps a false antithesis between investing in the productive sectors and investing in the social sectors, whereby social sectors people mean education, health, and social protection. But I think there's a lot of evidence to show how these investments in the social sectors are also very important for improving a productive capacity. But say in education, it's not just about getting more young people into school and into training institutions, it's the quality of the education. So I think our report makes a particular focus on the quality of the education, and that the education has to lead to the kind of skills that are going to improve people's human capital and help enhance the productive capacities of the country. Similarly, social protection measures are very important for addressing the policy, the commitment that we've all made now to no one left behind. So it's a really, really important policy for addressing that commitment. But it's also got positive synergies with enhancing the productive capacity of the country in a number of ways. And I'll just give one example. Quite a lot of countries now have introduced cash transfers of various kinds, many of them targeted to low-income women, both in rural and in urban areas. This kind of cash transfer not only enhances the immediate income of the people getting them, but also their capacity to invest in the education, nutrition, and health of their children, and to mitigate some of the risks that come when you're transforming the economy. So when you're having some kind of dynamic transformation process, it does involve risks. So you need some kind of risk mitigation strategy to enable people to participate in that and not only not get left behind, but not have their situation made worse. So the domestic policies that are needed to complement the international support in terms of trade that the least developed countries get does involve some attention to investment in what's very often known as the social sectors, as well as what might seem as the most obvious thing to do, and it does have to be done, which is invest directly in building productive capacity. So we need also the international community, I think, to support the least developed countries in this broad-based program of investment that will secure these positive synergies between improving productive capacity and realizing this wide range of sustainable development goals.
Okay, thank you very much, Diane. And then we give the floor to Keith Nurse.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. It's a pleasure to be here and contribute to the work of the CDP. I'm going to talk about the issue of industrial policy, industrial upgrading, and innovation as a basis for promoting sustainable development goals. The rationale is that, by and large, LDC's participation in the global economy has been fairly weak over time. In fact, it's estimated that although LDCs account for 12% of the world's population, they only account for 1% of global trade in goods and less than 2% of global GDP. And so in many respects, LDCs are fairly marginal in the global economy. And this is likely to change in the coming decades, particularly in terms of the increasing demand for resources, also in terms of what can be defined as the population dividend associated with younger populations in LDCs, and so on. And so in that regard, it's really significant for us to understand what are the possibilities for LDCs going forward. Although LDCs are a very heterogeneous group of countries, landlocked, small island economies, some are agricultural based, some are mostly exporters of minerals and fuel, some are heavily dependent on tourism. What they all have in common, by and large, is largely undiversified economies. And so it's the level of dependence on one or two goods or services that makes these economies increasingly vulnerable. And so the issue of diversification and the diversity of economic transactions and enterprises in the economy is a critical dimension of solving the economic challenges as well as the trade challenges. It also relates to the issue of the wider sustainable development goals. Because if you are trying to promote equity in the economy, if you are trying to promote the promotion of, let's say, carbon-friendly goods and services, and all the new areas of international trade that are possible for economies now, then you need a far more responsive and dynamic economic sector at home to respond to these opportunities. And so, in many respects, the issue then is how do we get from where we're at now to some preferred future? What would be the key elements of this process? Well, first of all, we've been looking at some of the existing constraints, and by and large, small economies and LDC economies have really small markets, and so this can be a major disincentive to investment. They are heavily dependent on imports, particularly for things like energy and food, as well as for health-related areas. And they also are very much focused on having very large domestic firms that are able to exploit these markets from a rent-seeking standpoint. And so they tend not to be very innovative firms because they can make substantial earnings exploiting the opportunities at home. And so the export potential tends to be fairly weak. So the issue of trade specialization and an undiversified economy is at the crux of the challenge that these economies are faced with. I mean, we have lots of data on some of these things. So for example, if you look at the data for the exports from LDCs, close to half of it is in fuel and other minerals. The next biggest share of goods exports relates to food and textiles and other semi-manufacturers. There has been some diversification into services, but close to 50–60% of those services are in tourism and travel. And they're largely restricted to the small island and developing economies within the LDC grouping. So then the question then arises, so where do we go next? In our discussions about industrial policy and promoting or achieving production capacity, we are largely focusing on production transformation as the key trigger for this transformation that we're talking about. And in this regard, we recognize that whereas some economies, like the Asian economies, have been able to utilize industrial policies in the 1970s and earlier to transform their economies, many of those possibilities are not open to LDCs today. One, it is that the technological paradigms have shifted, and so labor-intensive manufacturing is not necessarily a major area for significant growth in the coming future. We also recognize that the international trading regimes have become increasingly constrained, although in our analysis, what we have identified is that under the WTO regime, for example, there are many exemptions and waivers which LDCs enjoy, and those are not being maximized. And so it is not that we are arguing, for example, that the WTO regime is unduly restrictive. It is that LDCs have not yet been positioned to maximize on those opportunities built into the WTO regime, including the recently announced Nairobi package. And so we have suggested a few areas where there can be some areas for growth in policy among LDCs. And we're framing it largely as soft industrial policies, or what some refer to as innovation governance, where you focus more on building the capacity within LDCs for networking among firms, facilitating harmonization between public and private sector policies and agendas, and also focusing increasingly on economic and marketing intelligence so that LDCs are far more aware of what the emerging market conditions are for the goods and services that they produce. And ultimately, the goal here is to improve the value-added component in much of what LDCs now produce, because in many ways they are producing basic commodities and services, what we can call commodity goods and services. Some key areas for facilitating this transformation would include promoting innovation-driven enterprises. Many economies are focused on doing this right now. The issue of innovation has become one of the key buzzwords in development policy. So investing in startups is something that we would want to encourage LDCs to do more of. Also promoting things like incubators. These could be done at the national level or at the regional level. And also promoting what we call market integration programs, so that the new products and services that are generated can find new access to market. There's a critical role for governments in LDCs. A key area, of course, is promoting access to credit and capital, and this is something we've been discussing forever in development circles. But there are new ways of financing this process. Often, LDCs, like many other developing countries, are faced with high levels of debt. But what is very striking in most LDCs is the level or the share of government goods and services in the share of GDP. It tends to be very high. And so it offers an opportunity for what we call strategic government procurement, so that governments can utilize their procurement strategy to promote things, for example, like greening government buildings, promoting renewable energy, and all of these are new areas that would facilitate the promotion of sustainable development goals. There's a role for donors, and we see this more as in a complementary way. Of course, there's been a lot of effort in the area of aid for trade. We are still not quite sure, and Stefan did refer to it earlier in his presentation, whether aid for trade is generating the kind of diversification that we have been all dreaming for. In some respects, I think we need to be pushing a wider agenda where we focus not just on aid for trade, but also aid for innovation. I think in this regard, there's a clear role for the donors to promote innovation in developing countries, particularly in LDCs, and for the governments in these LDCs to play or have an ownership in the process through, for example, their strategic government procurement strategies, so that we are not just saddling the donors with this responsibility. It's a matter of ensuring that LDC governments play a partnership role. I think I'll leave my comments at that for now, and welcome your comments and questions. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you very much, Keith, and thank you to all the three committee members that made presentations. I'd like to just complement two ideas. The one is that in the report, by the way, we're going to present our recommendations to ECOSOC. Actually, we'll also send some recommendations for the Istanbul program, follow-up of the Istanbul program of action. And we're going to produce a policy paper, let's say, which is the result of this, which is the broader work that we have been doing quite intensively since last year that we're focusing on this week. But one issue that I think is quite important is that when we're talking about productive capacities, we're not only talking about international markets, also domestic markets. And actually the issue that Diane mentioned of agriculture is a particularly important one, given that it's also production for the domestic market that matters for food security in particular of LDCs. So it's a very important. Actually, agriculture, and this is, I guess, my personal obsession, being a topic which I have done work, is actually quite an interesting case also of how to guarantee more equitable results of development. In terms of in most developing countries and most LDCs, you have a significant share of let's say of family agriculture. To use the term that the FAO has coined in recent years, and family agriculture has the potential to become a source of more equitable, economic as well as social outcomes. And I think, but that of course requires, domestic support structures and international cooperation to be able to enjoy the benefits, including the possibility of participating in fair trade, for example, which is a growing part of international cooperation. And the other issue that I wanted to is in addition to the issues of international cooperation that Stefan referred to, I have my own particular obsession with international tax cooperation, which is a rising issue in the international agenda, as reflected in the importance that it was given in the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, but also the work of OECD BEPS, the base erosion and profit shifting, and I must say I am myself chair of a specific independent commission called ICRIC, Independent Commission on International Corporate Taxation. And we are, and all these initiatives, I think, are, try to, I mean, the IMF actually produced a very interesting research last year that showed that developing countries are 3 times more affected in relative terms by profit shifting of multinational corporations than developed countries. So the issue of tax cooperation is a very important issue. It's an important issue from the point of view of the international rules, let's say, but it's also to avoid tax competition that in many cases has resulted in the attraction of multinational investments that give very few tax revenues to developing countries, and including the LDCs, which are natural resource dependent. So this issue, I think, is quite important for the international agenda. We emphasize actually in our report the relevance of good governance structures, and good governance structures require good government revenues. And I guess, and as this is of course the obsessions of someone who has been finance minister at one point in his life. I said finance ministers only think about revenues. We need money to fulfill so many expectations. Anyway, so with these initial comments, I want to open the floor for comments, questions from you.